She went down on both knees in the middle of the drawing room, and the sound it made, the soft impact of a grown woman's knees against marble, was the quietest thing Edward Hargrove had ever heard that destroyed him completely. There were 6 people in that room. His mother-in-law Carolyn stood nearest the fireplace, arms folded, with the expression of a woman watching something she had arranged and was satisfied with. His estate manager Thomas stood near the door with the particular stillness of a man who wished he were somewhere else. 2 members of the household staff flanked the doorway, and Margaret Okafor, who had worked in this house for 4 years, who had never once in 4 years been late, who had never once taken a sick day, who had learned the names of every cut flower his wife Catherine had kept in the blue vase by the stairs, and kept them there still because no one had told her to stop. Margaret Okafor was on her knees on his marble floor, looking up at him with dry eyes and asking him to listen. He had not yet said a word. What no one in that room could have predicted was how the next 7 minutes would change everything Edward Hargrove thought he understood about the house he lived in, the woman who kept it, and the particular shape of his own blindness. Edward Hargrove was 48 years old, and he had been a widower for 18 months. Catherine had died of an aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon in March, without warning, without farewell, in the kitchen of the house they had shared for 11 years. She had been reaching for something on the top shelf. The paramedics said she would not have felt any pain. Edward had spent 11 months not knowing what to do with that information, and 7 months pretending it had helped. It was not a bad man. He was a grieving man, which is sometimes a more dangerous thing because grief has a way of wearing the face of discernment. It tells you that your suspicion is wisdom. It tells you that the wall you have built is protection. It does not tell you what you're keeping out along with the hurt. His mother-in-law, Caroline, had been in the house for 6 weeks. She came, she said, to help him manage. She had opinions about the staff. She had opinions about most things, delivered with the precision of someone who understood that grief made a person temporarily unwilling to argue. She had told him 3 days ago that she had reason to believe the housekeeper had been taking things. What kind of things? He had asked. The medication cabinet in the east bathroom, Caroline said. I counted myself. A bottle of fever reducer, antibiotics from last spring that Catherine never finished. He checked the inventory log Thomas keeps. The numbers don't match, and it is always the nights Margaret works late that the numbers change. He had not wanted to believe it. He had gone to the cabinet himself. He had checked the log. The numbers were wrong. He had sat with it for 3 days, wanting to find another explanation, finding none that fit. And on the 3rd day, Caroline had suggested he confront her directly, in front of the staff, so there would be no confusion later about what had been said. That was a cruelty he had not recognized as one. He recognized it now. Margaret had come into the drawing room at 6 in the evening, expecting apparently to arrange the flowers for tomorrow's breakfast table. She had walked in with a cloth over one arm and stopped when she saw the assembled faces. Caroline had spoken first, which was how it had been designed. She had spoken clearly, with the particular cruelty of a woman who has waited for a moment and rehearsed it. She named the missing medication. She named the dates. She produced the inventory log. She cited words like theft and breach of trust and the memory of the woman of this house, which was the most deliberate thing she said, using Catherine's absence as a weapon with such precision that Edward felt it in his chest. Margaret listened without moving. Her face was very still, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of someone who has been still under difficult things before and knows how to carry the weight of it without letting it show. When Caroline finished, she looked at Edward and nodded Caroline, which was the first thing that gave him pause, though he did not yet understand why. Mr. Hargrove, she said, may I speak? Let her speak, Caroline said, from the fireplace. It will be interesting to hear the explanation. Margaret had looked at the marble floor, a long moment. Then, with a deliberateness that he would think about for months afterward, she had lowered herself to her knees, not in collapse, not in despair. She went down with the controlled, purposeful movement of a woman making a choice, and when she looked up at him from that position, her eyes were dry and her voice, when she spoke, was the steadiest voice in the room. I am on my knees, Mr. Hargrove, she said, but not because you put me here. I am on my knees because that is where a mother goes when her child is burning up and she has nothing left. The room was very still. I took the medication, she said. I will not say I did not, because I did. I took the fever reducer and the old antibiotics. It took them 6 days ago when my son Oliver woke up with a temperature of 103, and I had $11 in my account, and the clinic on 5th was closed, and I did not know what else is to do. She paused. I was going to replace them this Friday when I was paid. I have a receipt for the same medications from the pharmacy on Garfield. They are in my bag. I was going to put them back before anyone needed them. I have never taken anything from this house in 4 years that was not given to me. She stopped. That is all I have to say. What happened next was not what Carolyn had planned. Carolyn had planned a dismissal. She had prepared language about trust and standards, and what Catherine would have expected. She opened her mouth. "Be quiet," Edward Hargrove said. It came out quieter than he intended, which made it more powerful than anything he could have shouted. Carolyn closed her mouth and looked at Margaret, who was still on her knees. "Get up," he said. "Please." She stood. She did not brush off her skirt or adjust her hair. She stood as though she had simply been sitting in a chair and risen from it. "Your son," Edward said. "Oliver." "Yes, sir." "How old is he?" 9. "Is he alone now?" Something crossed her face. The first crack in the stillness. A hairline fracture. "My neighbor checks on him when I'm working. She is 81. She does what she can." The room was silent. The fire in the fireplace made the only sound it always made, the particular language of burning wood, that has no interest in human arrangements. Edward Hargrove looked at the inventory log in his hand. He set it down on the side table. He looked at Carolyn, and what she saw in his face made her take one step backwards without appearing to decide to. "Thomas," he said, without looking away from Carolyn. "Get Dr. Ellison on the phone. Tell him I need him to make a house call tonight. I'll text you the address." He turned to Margaret. "What is the address?" she told him. He texted Thomas. Then he looked at Carolyn Ashworth, his wife's mother, the woman who had sat at their table for 11 years of Sunday lunches, and who had, in the 6 weeks since she had arrived in his home under the guise of helping, been dismantling it with the patience of someone who had been waiting for permission. And he said very quietly, "I'd like you to go home." "Edward, I will call you," he said. "When I am ready, go home." She went. The drawing room was very still after the sound of her heels on the marble faded. Ed did not go home to his grief that night. He drove. He had told Thomas to send the doctor. He had told Thomas to call him the moment the boy's fever came down. And then he found himself in his car on the street outside the house. The wide, well-lit, well-kept street that his address described and the property values of the surrounding houses confirmed. And he could not make himself go back inside. Not yet. Not to the drawing room with its marble floor and its fire and the inventory log, sitting on the side table like an accusation that had already done its damage and could not be called back. Not to the chair where Catherine used to sit with her book on winter evenings, her feet tucked beneath her reading glasses halfway down her nose, the chair no one sat in anymore. No one had been able to. It drove the way people drive, when they need to be moving but have no destination, out of the good streets and into the functional ones, past the hardware shops and the laundromats with their fluorescent lights burning regardless of the hour, past the restaurants with their chairs stacked on the tables and their owners counting the till, past the petrol stations where the forecourt lights turned everything the same gray-white. The streets he knew gave way to streets he recognized only as streets, the ones without names you remember, where the architecture stops making arguments about itself and simply exists. A row of terraced houses, a corner shop with metal shutters, a school behind a chain-link fence, its playground empty and somehow very large, in the dark. The city changed around him the way it always changes when you drive in one direction long enough and stop looking for landmarks. The streetlights thinned. The pavement at the road's edge gave way in places to packed dirt that had pushed up through what had once been pavement and not been pushed back. The buildings lowered and aged, and wore the particular expression of structures that have been holding themselves together through sheer stubbornness for years. Roofs that dipped slightly at the center, walls whose pointing had been repointed in a different shade and not quite matched. Front doors that no longer sat perfectly square in their frames because the frames had settled and the doors had not. It passed a row of apartment buildings that might have been 3 stories, or 4, indistinct in the thin light from the one working lamp on the far pole. with windows that showed the blue flicker of television screens through curtains so thin they were almost not there. He pulled over. He was not certain why. He sat in his car for a long moment. Through the windscreen, the street was very quiet. A dog crossed at the far end without urgency. A light in a second-floor window went off, then on again, the way lights do when someone is moving through a room in a hurry. He thought about Oliver, no 21-year-old, alone in an apartment with an 81-year-old neighbor doing what she could. A fever for 6 days, a mother on her knees, on marble, not because she was broken, but because she had run out of other options and chosen the only one that had any chance of working. He had a son of his own. Daniel was 12 and lived with Catherine's sister in Somerset. The arrangement they had made when Edward understood in the months after Catherine died that he was not stable enough to be the only adult in his son's daily life. Daniel came for school holidays. He had his mother's hair and his father's habit of going very quiet when he was thinking something large. Edward called him every other night and listened to his voice on the phone and thought about Catherine and about the shape of what he had failed to protect her from, which was nothing, which was a random electrical event in a perfectly ordinary brain, which was the thing he could not accept because there was no one to hold accountable for it, and he was a man who needed accountability in order to understand the world. He thought about what Margaret had said. That is where a mother goes when her child is burning up and she has nothing left. He thought about the $11. He thought about the pharmacy receipt in her bag, the medications she had intended to replace before anyone found them missing. He thought about what it cost a person to plan that carefully, to take only what was needed, to document the intent to return it, to carry the receipt as proof of a transaction no one had asked her to prove. He thought about Carolyn and the inventory log and the 3 days he had waited before acting. The 3 days during which he had allowed suspicion to calcify into certainty because grief had made him stupid in the specific way grief does, by making you distrust everything that isn't pain. His phone buzzed. Thomas. Dr. Ellison had seen the boy. Fever was coming down. The antibiotics had been right. Oliver was asking for his mother. Edward sat with that for a moment. Then he started the car and drove. He did not go home. He drove to the address Margaret had given, a narrow street he had passed without noting on his way out of the neighborhood, with a building on the corner that had a new lock on a very old door, the kind of lock that costs more than anything else in the apartment because it is the one thing a mother on a cleaning salary will always find the money for, the one thing she will not compromise on. The light in the second-floor window was on. Through the curtain, thin fabric, the kind that lets light through in both directions, he could see movement. A small figure in a bed, a woman sitting beside the bed with her hand on the figure's forehead, the way his mother had sat with her hand on his forehead when he was small. A gesture so old, it predates. Language, a gesture that says, I am here and I am measuring and I will not let anything past me. He could not hear anything from the street. He sat in his car and watched the silhouette of Margaret Okafor sitting beside her son's bed, and he did not start the engine. Then he heard it. The window was not quite closed, swollen in the frame the way old windows get, not sealing properly at the top. Sound came through the gap. A child's voice, thin with the weakness of fever but alive, asking the question in the tone children use when they have been lying in the dark long enough to think the things they normally don't have the courage to put into words. Mom, the voice said, am I going to die? Because Dad did, and he didn't come back. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It felt like every silence Edward had ever sat in compressed into one. Margaret's voice came then, low, steady, the same voice she had used on the marble floor, the voice that did not change its quality based on who was listening or what was at stake. No, she said. You're not going to die. Your temperature is going down. Dr. Ellison says you'll be back at school by Thursday. A pause. Your father went because it was his time. It is not your time. I need you here. Do you understand me? I need you here. Another pause. Then the thin voice. Okay, Mom. Okay, she said. Sleep now. Edward Hargrove sat in his car on that street and could not move. His hands were on the steering wheel, and he could not make them do anything. It felt as though the floor of the car had dropped away beneath him. A weightless second, that was not frightening but was total. A moment in which everything he thought he had understood about the preceding hours reorganized itself into a different shape that he could not have seen from where he had been standing. She had gone to her knees for that voice. She had gone to her knees for that thin, feverish 9-year-old voice in the second-floor window of a building with a new lock on an old door. And she had taken $11 worth of medication and documented her intention to replace it, because she was the kind of woman who documents her intentions even when there is no one watching. Because being that kind of woman is not a performance, but a nature. And he had stood in his drawing room and said nothing while Carolyn Ashworth used the memory of his wife as a weapon against her. He pressed his hands flat against the steering wheel. He thought about Catherine. He thought about what Catherine would have done, not what he imagined she would have done. The saintly retrospective version of her he had been building in the 18 months since she died, but what the actual Catherine, impatient and warm and definite, would have done if she had been standing in that drawing room. She would not have waited 3 days. She would have asked a single question, gotten the answer, and handled it in 10 minutes, and then she would have found a way to make it right. It missed her with a suddenness that was physical, like acid in the chest, like cold water on a hot afternoon, like the last candle going out. It sat with it for a moment because that was what you did. You sat with it, and you let it be as large as it was, and then you thought about what came next. It drove home. He called his estate manager. He asked him to have the drawing room cleared and to call the household staff together the following morning. A asked him one other thing, which Thomas received with a long pause and then said, "Yes, sir, I can do that." That night, he went upstairs and sat in the chair beside his son's empty bed. Daniel's room, kept exactly as his son liked it, for the holidays, and he wrote 2 letters. One was to his solicitor. One was to Margaret Okafor, addressed to the apartment on the street with a new lock on the old door, to be delivered with a car the following morning. The letter said, "Please come to the house at 10 o'clock. There is something I need to say in front of the people who were present yesterday. After that, there is something I would like to ask you, if you are willing to hear it. Your son is welcome to come. There is a garden. I believe boys of 9 do well in gardens." She came. She arrived at 10 past 10, which was the exact time the traffic from her neighborhood made inevitable rather than disrespectful. She was wearing a dark coat and her hair was pinned back, and she held Oliver's hand in the doorway. And Oliver, who was pale and slightly hollow-eyed still but upright. The way children are upright the day after a fever, all the illness concentrated into a paleness that makes them look briefly translucent, looked at the house with the expression of a child encountering a scale of architecture he has not previously encountered and choosing to find it interesting rather than intimidating. "There is a door to the garden through the kitchen," Edward said. "Thomas will show him. The dog is out there. His name is Birch. He is extremely large and completely harmless." Oliver looked at his mother. She nodded once. He went. The drawing room held Thomas, the 2 senior housekeepers, and the 2 staff members who had been present the previous evening. The fireplace was not lit today. The room was filled instead with the flat morning light from the tall windows that looked onto the front garden. There was no marble coldness to it this morning. It was just a room. Edward Hargrove stood at the center of it and did not sit. "Yesterday," he said, "something happened in this room that should not have happened the way it happened. Mrs. Okafor was accused in front of witnesses without being given the opportunity to explain herself before being accused, and she was humiliated in this house by a guest of mine, using my authority and my failure to slow down as the mechanism. I am responsible for that. I am saying so now in front of the same people who were here yesterday, because what was done publicly requires a public correction." He paused. "The medication was taken," he said. "She has not denied it, and I am not asking her to. She took it for the reason she described, with the intention she described, with the documentation she described. I have had Thomas review the inventory logs going back 4 years." He looked at Thomas, who nodded. "There is no other discrepancy. None. In 4 years. He stopped for a moment. "The inventory log I was shown yesterday was altered. I do not yet know by whom." He did know. He had simply not decided yet how to address it. "I am having it reviewed." He looked at Margaret, who was standing near the window with her hands folded in front of her, and who was looking back at him with the expression of a woman listening carefully, reserving judgment, not allowing herself to feel anything yet that she could not afford to feel. "I would like to apologize," he said. "Not in private. Here." She looked at him for a long moment. "I accept it," she said. "Thank you." There was a quality to those 4 words, the simplicity of them, the absence of anything extra, no performance of graciousness, no inflation of the moment, that made Thomas, near the door, look very carefully at the floor. What came after that was quieter. The staff were excused. Thomas brought tea, which was what Thomas did in moments that required something to do with one's hands. Edward and Margaret sat in the drawing room with the flat morning light between them, and he placed on the table in front of her a document he had asked his solicitor to prepare the previous night. He had thought, on the drive home and in the quiet of Daniel's room, about the shape of what had been missing in the house, not just since Catherine died, but before in the life of the household. In the gap between what the house appeared to be and what it actually was, for the people who lived and worked inside it. Catherine had known the names of the staff's children. She had known who was saving up for what, who had a parent in difficulty, who needed a Tuesday morning off for a school play. After she died, that knowing had died with her. No one had been appointed to carry it. "I don't know your son's middle name," Edward said. "I don't know whether Oliver's father is living." He paused. "I know the name of every cut flower Catherine kept in the blue vase, because you kept them there, and I have never once asked you why." Margaret looked at the vase, which stood on the side table with the first freesias of the season in it, pale yellow and slightly waxy in the morning light. She had put them there 2 days ago. "She told me when I first came that they were her favorite," she said. She said the name out loud once. Fresias, the way people say the name of something they love. I remembered. He looked at the vase for a long moment. "His name was Joseph," Margaret said. "Oliver's father. He died 4 years ago. Construction accident. His site was not this company's, but it was this industry's. He was 31. She stopped. "Oliver was 5. It doesn't remember his face clearly anymore. He remembers his hands." The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Edward said. "I was blind." 2 sentences. The entire arc of a man's reckoning in 2 sentences. He meant them both precisely. He pushed the document across the table. "I would like to establish a fund," he said. "In Joseph's name. It will cover emergency medical costs for children of household and estate staff, not just mine, across the network of homes I manage in an advisory capacity. 12 familias in this city alone who employ cleaning and domestic staff. None of them have anything in place for this." He stopped. "I would like you to chair it, not as a charity appointment, as a genuine administrative role, with a proper contract and a proper salary. I would like you to tell me what it needs to be useful, and I will fund it to that level." Margaret looked at the document. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way she had looked at everything in the preceding 24 hours, with the careful, unhurried attention of a woman who has learned that things are not always what they appear to be in either direction, and that it costs nothing to look thoroughly before you reach. Then she picked it up. She read it through once. She turned to the second page. She read the salary figure. She set it down. "Oliver starts secondary school in September," she said. It was not a non sequitur. It was the thing at the center of everything, and she said it the way she said all her most important things, directly, without decoration. "The fund covers educational costs as well," he said, "for dependents of anyone under its remit, including Oliver." She was quiet for a long moment. From the garden, through the tall window, came the sound of a dog, large, exuberant, entirely certain of its own goodwill, and a child's laughter, sudden and unguarded, and absolutely well, rising up over the garden wall and into the room, like something arriving from a direction no one had been watching. Margaret Okafor looked toward the window. The morning light fell across her face, and she did not try to manage the expression it found there, which was not a small thing, because she was a woman who had been managing her expressions for a very long time. On the side table, the candle in its holder, unlit, placed there by the housekeeper that morning as a matter of habit, bent its wick toward her in a draft, from nowhere, as though something in the room had shifted its direction without being asked to. She signed the document on the second page, in the line that awaited her name, with the pen he offered her. She signed it with the same unhurried precision with which she folded cloth, as though the gesture itself deserved to be done correctly, as though anything worth doing deserved nothing less. The Joseph Okafor Emergency Medical and Education Fund was established on the 15th of the month. The announcement was brief and carried no photograph of anyone, because Margaret had asked that it not, and Edward had agreed without discussion. It named Joseph. It named what it was for. It named the 12 families it would initially serve. 3 more families requested participation in the first week. Oliver started secondary school in September and announced to his mother on the first evening that the mathematics teacher was brilliant and that there was a robotics club he intended to join. Aside this at the kitchen table in the apartment on the narrow street, eating the food she had made, in the voice of a boy who is planning his future as a matter of routine. Margaret listened to all of it. She asked the right questions. After he went to bed, she sat at the table for a while in the quiet of the apartment and looked at the window, at the city beyond it doing what cities do, at the dark and then the light as clouds moved across whatever was behind them. She thought about Joseph's hands, which Oliver remembered. She thought about the blue vase on the side table in the house on the good street, and about what it meant to keep a dead woman's flowers alive for 4 years, not because anyone asked you to, but because you remembered the name she had said out loud, and the way she had said it. She thought about what it costs a person to stay that faithful to something when no one is looking, and what it is worth, and whether those 2 numbers are ever the same. They are not always the same, but there are mornings, flat, honest mornings with the light coming in straight, when what a thing is worth and what it costs you arrive at the same number. And you are allowed to feel that and to let it be enough. If you have ever worked in a house that was not yours, keeping things alive that you were never asked to keep, staying faithful to a standard that no one was measuring, you already understand what Margaret Okafor understood, that the work is the work, whether anyone is watching or not. That a receipt in a bag for medications you intended to return is not a defense. It is a character. That a woman on her knees is not a woman who has been defeated. If she chose the position and knows why she is in it, and looks up with dry eyes and says the true thing in the quiet voice that cannot be argued with. Some things cannot be taken from a person, not by a marble floor, not by 6 witnesses, not by a woman with an inventory log and a careful cruelty and a dead woman's memory as her weapon. The thing inside Margaret Okafor that had gone down on both knees and looked up and told the truth was the same thing that had kept the freesias in the blue vase for 4 years, that had held Oliver's hand through 6 nights of fever, that had planned carefully and documented honestly and trusted that Friday would come in time. Friday always comes, and when it does, what a person carried in the dark, quietly, faithfully, without applause, is always worth more than what was carried against them. That is not a comfort. It is a fact. And facts, unlike comfort, do not require anything of you. They simply stand, the way a woman stands when she has said what she needed to say, in the flat, honest light, in the room that is just a room now with the sound of a child laughing in the garden outside.